Good afternoon. My name is Bob Elias, and I'd like to welcome you to our 20th lecture of the fall quarter. We ran into a little difficulty because the Daily Bruin wasn't publishing today, so we had no way of advertising what I think will probably turn out to be one of my favorite lectures of the quarter. As you know, since you're here, we have with us today Mr. Hal Roach, who is one of the few people alive that can truly be called one of the geniuses of comedy. In the early comedies of the silent screen, of Laurel and Hardy, Our Gang, it was Mr. Roach who brought them together and who gelled them into the funny men that they were. He was the first one to bring animals onto the screen. And we have today with us some film clips that he brought from Laurel and Hardy and other things. And before I bring Mr. Roach onto the stage, I figured it would be a good idea to start off by showing these film clips. So as soon as we're ready with those, we'll start that, and then we'll continue with our questions and answers.
drink. You went to the party, didn't you?
Well, we haven't come a lot further than that so far in comedy. That's about as good as you'll come. We have a microphone here, and Mr. Roach will be answering questions. Anything you might want to know about Laurel and Hardy, our gang, Harold Lloyd, Chaplin, anything. Just step right up and ask your question.
Mr. Roach, I'd like to know how much...
hold on, excuse me. Mr. Roach, he just wants to make a statement first. You want to do it up there? Yeah. Sure. This is all planned.
I wrote a script. He's not going to talk me out of it. To start with, my wife told me, Hal, why don't you just stay home and be thought dumb and go talk to these college people and remove all doubt. And you don't pay anything for your appearance here. All you get is free lunch. So all the pearly words of wisdom you get from me, don't forget that, as I say, you're only getting one lunch worth this thing. You brought up an idea of question and answers, and I think that I can tell you a lot of the answers before they ask the questions. So a lot of the questions are going to be how to succeed in the motion picture industry or the amusement industry or the television industry. And I think that like any other industries, you have to steal, cheat, and lie like they do to be success in every other kind of business. And to give you an angle of what I'm talking about, we'll start with the writers first. And you take the well-known plots that there are, such as the Bible, Cinderella, Red Riding Hood, Kismet, Romeo and Juliet, and so forth. And all surefire things. I mean, if you're playing bridge, you got 52 cards, and out of those 52 cards come billions of different hands that can be made with the 52. If there are 52 original plots, as many billions of stories can be made out of those plots. So, I mean, I advise writers to do a little bit of stealing from the guy that has written before, take the kind of plots they have, and then put those plots into the kind of stories that you know you can write. I mean, you can write Romeo and Juliet about a service station or anything else. I don't know if you understand quite what I mean by that, but it's a question of a very small change from the one plot to the other, modernizing it. So many writers are inclined to write something that they don't, about something that they really don't understand. So much for the writers. And then I say cheat. That is not cheating in the way that it sounds, but as far as directors, producers, are concerned, that people that want to get in that part of the business, watch the other fellows' pictures, see what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and then from them learn, and how you can take from them different angles that you can do in the different stories that you're going to do. And then it comes to the thing called live. This gets into the angle of actors. If you're talking to an agent or to a casting director, and you kind of size him up, if it looks like he's from California and he says, "What's your experience?" "Oh, I did a couple of summer stock in Keokuk, Iowa, or I did a few shows on Broadway, off Broadway." If you get in, and if he looks like he wants to make dirty pictures, you say, "Well, I made a few pictures for the Lutheran Church." If you think he wants to make clean pictures, you say, "Well, you made some pictures that were so dirty that they can't be seen anyway." I mean, that's a basis of the... And then we get from there to a thing called acting. Acting is exactly what it means: portraying something. That is, portraying something that you are not rather than something that you are. And you've heard so many times the person say, "Well, I don't want to be typed. Name me one star that isn't typed." If you're going to go into the acting career as far as the amusement industry is concerned, try to find out what it is that you can do best and stick with that and try to develop a character from that angle of the business. Getting quick into comedy, visual comedy, the thing that is almost disappearing now, the kind of thing you see here. Comedy is from children. The idea of slapstick comedy is sometimes brutal, sometimes not, but the brutality of the thing comes from the idea that a little kid learning to walk falls down 100 times and the parents try to laugh him out of it. He falls off of this or falls off of that. The first thing that happens, you try to get the child to first laugh him out of it. If he cries, you know that it is hurt, then it's a different story. But the basis of all great comedians, Laurel with this, and Hardy with the tie, Charlie Chaplin's Walk, Jackie Gleason's Drunk, are all taken from children. I only bring this point out to show you that the basis of so-called visual comedy comes from the idea, actually, of the actions of little children. And as long as there are little children, that kind of visual comedy will continue. Now, you take a thing like Stan Laurel's Cry, which is very funny, as a rule. He doesn't cry when he's hurt. He doesn't cry when he's scared. He only cries when he is confused, which is the same thing a little kid does. He's in the kitchen and he does something wrong. His parents comes in and say, "What did you do in the kitchen?" He doesn't know the answer, but he knows if he cries, he gets sympathy. So he starts to cry. The parents know that he is not really hurt because he wasn't crying before, and therefore the laugh becomes, that is, the cry becomes humorous instead of becoming serious. The visual comedy, pies, who throws them and who gets hit is the important thing. In comedy, like in drama, you must establish your hero, your heroine, your heavy, and so on. So it isn't funny for just somebody to hit somebody else with a pie. It's who throws a pie and who gets hit that's funny. Now I got through with only one thing more here. A question has always been asked me about the girls that worked for me, such as Jean Harlow, Lupe Velis, Carol Landis, and Marilyn Monroe. And they have said, "Hal, really, didn't you once in a while sort of make passes at these beautiful girls who were working for you?" And I said, "That's a very exaggerated situation. And I assure you that maybe 1 or 2 or 3,000 times I did, but that's all. Now I can go to the questions. Oh, we got here to the question.
Well, you could stand because they'll be asking them right on. Okay, let's take our first question.
Yes, Mr. Roach, I'd like to know how much of the Our Gang script was improvised?
How much of the Our Gang script was improvised? Our Gang.
Less than most other things because of the kids themselves. It was when we made silent pictures, which you didn't see now, the director could direct them all the way through. When sound came in, then it was necessary for the kids to learn their lines, and therefore the director had to be still during the scene. And therefore, I would say more, as far as the kids were concerned, than any other comedies we made, they followed the script.
Mr. Roach, you were quite an entrepreneur in the motion picture industry, and I wanted to ask you, since I'm interested in that end of it, in financing, and eventually, I was thinking of asking you if you could give us briefly some pointers on someone that would be interested in, say, eventually going into the amusement end of the motion picture industry. In other words, something like Hal Roach Studios. In other words, how did you start Hal Roach Studios, and how did you run it? If you can briefly tell us a little bit about that.
Can you briefly tell them about the business end of how did you get into Hal Roach Studios? How did you run it?
I started as an actor. I wasn't a very good actor, so I became an assistant director. And an independent company in Los Angeles made an independent picture, and I got the job as assistant director. And it was financed by local money, and the attorney for this company came out every day to see how they were spending the money. He couldn't talk to the director, who also happened to be the leading man, so all he could talk to me. He had a client who had money, who wanted to get into business, and I convinced him that I was the greatest unfound director in the business. And he then got this other man, who was Dwight Whiting, still living in Los Angeles, to finance me. We started making comedies. We had no studio. We picked the people up at their home with a car, a very old Pope Hartford, and we made one-reel comedies for $350 a piece, which we afterwards sold to Pathé. And then they started to make money. So we had a studio downtown. We made enough money to build a studio in Culver City, and that's about it.
Well, since you were the greatest director probably that ever lived as far as comedy was concerned, how would you find a man of your caliber? How would you know if you found someone that was near your caliber that you could back?
How would you know if you found a true genius in comedy that you could back? How do you know that he's the right guy?
Well, I think that there are dozens of comedians now in television and in, to some extent, motion pictures that would be as great as the comedians of the past. You've got to, somebody has got to make them. There are two important things. A, Laurel and Hardy seldom made any film in the morning. They rehearsed. 50% that is written for comedy will not play. When you get on the set with the props and all, and you start to make the thing, you find out it is not as funny as it sounded on paper. Now you've got to change it so it is funny. And in television, you just can't afford to do that. You have to send a script in to the sponsor, to the advertising agency, to the network, and they approve the script. Therefore, you can't deviate from that script on television because it's already been approved. And you just haven't got the time or the money to make the kind of comedies that should be made.
Mr. Roach? Apparently for many years, a lot of the great comedies of the 20s and 30s were shelved, and nobody was going to see them. And in the last few years, particularly on college campuses, there's been a great revival, particularly of Chaplin and Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers. To what do you account this kind of gap of interest in between and then the rediscovering of them now?
Well, I think the biggest difficulty was this. Comedy is essentially brief. If you make a two-reel comedy, you get up about to here. If you make a feature comedy, you got to go clear up to here, because if you're going to tell funny stories, you have to keep your best one for the last, or you'll flop at the finish. So I mean, the whole basis of comedy, you must build as you go along to funnier situations until you get to the conclusion. Now the difference between, say, 30 minutes of a two-reeler against an hour and 20 minutes of a five-reeler makes an awful lot of difference. Therefore, it takes a very good story, very good actors, very good comedians, and to go for feature length. And there is no market today except on television for short comedies, and there's just not enough money on television to make them good.
Well, about the great comedians, the Chaplins and the Marx Brothers and the rest, they weren't, the films themselves made by these men weren't being reshown, but now they apparently are being reshown. I mean, there's a lot of places around the city of Los Angeles you can see the Marx Brothers or Charlie Chaplin once in a while, whereas a few years ago it wasn't always the case. To what do you account the revival of these men's older films themselves, whereas a few years ago they might not?
Why is there such a revival of these old films now and not earlier? Why was there?
Well, because, as I say, that the lapse of time came because they were on for a certain period of time. Then they stopped. New comedians came in, such as Milton Berle on television, other comedians like Groucho Marx on television and so on. And the visual end of comedy was forgotten for a time. Then all of a sudden somebody began to see visual comedies, which are a great deal different than oral comedies, and therefore they began to have a sort of revival. There would not be a revival if somebody else is making them as good as they are today. It's only because there's no alternate that I think makes the revival important today.
One quick question. What do you think's the funniest picture you ever saw?
The funniest picture you ever wrote or saw?
What?
What's the funniest picture you ever wrote or saw?
The funniest picture I ever wrote?
Or saw?
Well, the funniest picture I think that I ever wrote was Grandma's Boy with Harold Lloyd. And I think the funniest picture with Laurel and Hardy was the one about the Foreign Legion. I forgot what the name of it was. Very funny about that picture, the Foreign Legion. Jean Harlow was started with me, and then she went with Metro, and so I called her and asked her if I could use her photograph in a comedy. She says, "Why, certainly." So if you ever saw that picture, I mean, Jean Harlow is a leading lady, and all we ever showed of her was a photograph.
Could you tell me something about your acquaintance with Jimmy Finlayson and what it was like working with him?
What's your acquaintance with Finlayson?
Jimmy Finlayson, in the first place, all good comedians were very fine actors. There isn't one person that became a success as a comedian that wasn't a very good actor. Jimmy Finlayson was one of the very best actors. He was the best take-em artist we had, or double take-em as we used to kid him about. He was a Scotchman. He didn't believe in spending money, and but was one of the best character comedians, I think, in the industry.
Mr. Roach, I heard that Stan Laurel, for some reason, did not like to do his laughing act in a lot of the comedies, that he was sort of hesitant about doing this. Is this true?
Is it true that Stan Laurel was hesitant to do his laughing act in comedy?
His what?
His laughing act.
Or his crying act, I
Crying
should say.
act.
Did he what?
That Stan Laurel was hesitant to do his crying act. Is it true?
If he was, I don't recall it. In fact, the crying thing was Stan's own idea, not anybody else's.
I see. And also, around 1929, when the talking pictures came in, I heard that there was some hesitancy about accepting them, that the general public was not really enthused about it in a sense that people thought that they were just a passing fad. Why is it that talking pictures didn't really have a great popularity at first?
Why didn't the talkies, when they first came in, have a great popularity? People thought it was a passing fad. Why?
Well, I don't think that your information is quite right about that. When sound pictures came in, I was releasing through Metro, and we got as much for a two-reel comedy in sound as they were getting for features. And I think the most prosperous time of the Hal Roach studios was the first 1 or 2 years of talking pictures. There were some comedians that voice didn't quite match their looks, but they soon changed that, and the only thing that was sound with us was it was very difficult for the directors to direct the R gang, because now the kids had to be able to remember the scene all the way through and not being told what to do as the scene went along.
And one last question. What percentage of all silent pictures would you say were made in Los Angeles?
What percentage?
Up to, say, 1930.
What percentage of the silent films up to 30 were made in L.A.?
Percentage?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. The percentage in the United States or in the world?
No, just in Los Angeles.
In L.A.
Oh, I would say that at least 90% of the sound pictures, there were a lot of short pictures made in New York with orchestras and vaudeville acts and things of that kind when sound first came out, but those things did not go very well.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question that I'd like to ask. Laurel and Hardy is one of the few teams that made the transition from silent comedy into sound comedy successfully. I was wondering if you could explain the things they had, the things that were involved in making this transition.
Well, I think that the transition is very simple, because both Laurel and Hardy had had stage experience, and they had talked on the stage before they got into pictures. So it was not a great transition as far as they were concerned. I mean, Laurel, of course, being English, had a bit of an English accent, which was easily understood. Hardy was a Southerner, but his was also easily understood. And actually, there wasn't any too much dialogue in the Laurel and Hardy pictures anyway.
Well, could you tell us something about Laurel and Hardy, like their work habits, how the first time they met, how you got them to work together, how they gelled as a team?
Well, Hardy was a heavy in comedies in Hollywood, and he worked for a lot of people, then came to work for me steadily. Laurel came into Los Angeles. He was in vaudeville on Main Street in an act with his wife, with a slapstick act. Somebody told me to see the act. I saw it. I liked it. I put him under contract. But in those days, they didn't have panchromatic film. And Laurel had very light blue eyes. His eyes didn't photograph. So we had to do something with him. I had him under contract, so he became a writer, a gag writer at the studio. Then panchromatic film came in. We then made a test of him. His eyes did photograph with that kind of film. It just happened that with the first picture he was in, Hardy was in. And they had a little scene together, and so next picture. And then Leo McCary, who at that time was at our studio and became a very fine director, and he saw them, and then I think that we decided to put them in a picture together, and I think Leo McCary directed the first one. At least he directed Putting Pants on Philip, which is a darn funny picture, I think.
I'd like to ask one more question, if I may. Certain comedies, they were shot at a certain speed, and when they're shown today, they're sped up a little. They're faster. I'm sure you've seen, they're mostly with Chaplin and some Harold Lloyd movies. I didn't notice it too much here. But could you explain if you think this enhanced the humor, or whether when you watch these, whether it bothers you?
Well, going back to the silent pictures, you had 16 frames to the second as against 24 to the second in sound pictures. Why they picked out 24, nobody knows. But 16 was the dramatic pictures ran at 16, the projection ran at 16. In comedies, we turned our cameras at 12 in order to speed up the action. Then when comedians were going out of the scene or long scene, we would slow the camera down so we'd get them out quicker. And therefore, the exaggeration between dramatic and comedy pictures was more when you come into sound or see them on 24 because we were only running at 12.
And how do you think this affects the humor? Being shown?
Well, there's a great comedy slowed down a lot with dialogue and sound, and we had a great deal of difficulty in the very first comedies because there would be a laugh, and then to see where the dialogue would come in, that the people wouldn't be laughing over the dialogue and miss something that was important for story point. But outside of that, as I say, in silent pictures you moved much faster and told much more story in a two-reeler than you did with a talking picture.
I was wondering whatever happened to the different members of the Our Gang comedies, and if you're in contact with any of them now.
What happened to the Our Gang people, and are you in contact with any of them?
Well, there some lady has just written a book about them, and there are one of your very important doctors in Los Angeles was a member of the gang. One of the important men in public relations in New York was a member of the gang. Some of them ended up in jail. Some of them had a rather unfortunate ending. But I think of the dozens and dozens of children we had in the Our Gang that was just about average. I mean, the way they came out. Some of them stayed in the business, like Jackie Cooper and Johnny Downs, but most of them went into other lines of endeavor because they left when they were pretty young. I don't think we ever had any children over 12 years old in the gang.
Yes, sir. How did you discover the kids that played in Our Gang?
How did you discover the kids that played in Our Gang?
I'll try to tell this quickly. In the early days of pictures, mothers brought their children in to try to get them a job in pictures. The first thing they did is curl their hair, cover their face with makeup, false eyelashes, and all of the things that you could do to make up a kid. And this particular, some friend had a friend that had a little girl they thought was great. And this little girl came into my office. She did her dance, spoke her piece, sang her song, and looked all the world like a trained animal to me, and I just couldn't wait for this kid to get out of my office. I felt this kid never gets a chance to play, or they must do nothing but teach it to do all these things. And finally, the little girl left. I went to the window, and the railroad line goes near the window, and here are 4 or 5 kids. Across the road was a lumber mill, and they had little strips that they'd cut off to make boards, and these kids had picked up some of these strips. They were going to throw them away a block away, but one big kid had a long strip that had claimed by a little kid. For 15 minutes, they couldn't see me. I listened to this conversation of who owned which of these strips, and it was the most important thing in their lives. I mean, who owned this thing, which were absolutely worthless, really. And all of a sudden I said, that child, all made up, I don't want to see. And I spent 15 minutes, and I said, well, those kids have no makeup. They're just doing things that normal kids would do. Well, we had just made a picture with Sunshine Sammy with Harold Lloyd. Mickey Daniels had just played a very good part in a picture for Universal. Our still cameraman had a very good daughter, Mary Cornman, and a couple of other kids that we thought were good. And I said, well, we can make maybe a dozen of these things with kids before the people get tired of it. And I made one picture, not knowing what I had. I showed it to Sid Groman. Without asking anybody, he immediately put it in Groman's theater. And from then on, I mean, the Our Gang were a success for many years.
One more question. Now, what did Spanky do after he was through working with Our Gang?
What did Spanky do after he was through with Our Gang?
Oh, there's so many of the kids I can't recall. I did hear just the other day, but I can't recall exactly what he's doing now. I think he was a master of ceremonies on a radio station for a while. I'm not sure. But after we started the gang, we never had to look for another kid. They were knocking at our door day after day. I mean, the other kids came from all over the United States.
Mr. Lloyd, there were rumors, Mr. Roach, I'm sorry. There were rumors about, like, in the mid-30s that Laurel and Hardy had a feud and that they were going to break up, and other people said it was just a contract hassle. Do you know what actually happened?
Some people were saying in the 30s that Laurel and Hardy had a feud and were going to break up or something.
To my knowledge, Laurel and Hardy never had a feud. And they got along exceptionally well together. Hardy was an excellent actor who never said anything about production. Laurel was one of the finest gag men in the business. When I say gag men, that is the construction of individual pieces of business. Laurel was not good on the overall story, but he was great as a gag man. Laurel and Hardy always got along very well together, and there was never, I never remember, I mean, if they had any fights, they always had them with me. They never had them with each other.
Mr. Roach, how does the young writer get a script that he or she feels is ready for a screen test or for stage to the people who can do something with it when you don't know anybody at all?
How does a writer get a script to somebody when you don't know anybody at all?
Get a script from somebody?
No, if you have one, how do you get it to somebody?
Oh, you mean if you have a script that you think is good, then how do you present the script? Well, I mean, mail is as good as any way that I can think of. But first you've got to figure what kind of company would want that kind of a script. And who would it appeal to? I mean, who is your leading lady? Who would be, who has connections with that lady? If it's about a man, who is the man, and so on.
Would a theatrical agency be a good place, or should you send it?
A literary agent would be the ones to handle the script. It's very difficult. Of course, they handle most known writers and so on. It takes an exceptional script to get a literary agent interested.
Thank you.
This will be our last question.
Concerning the Our Gang comedies, I'd appreciate it if you could go into any particular difficulties there were in working with these very young children and getting them onto film, doing what they were supposed to.
Could you go into some of the difficulties with working with these young kids?
The what?
The difficulties with working with the young kids.
Oh, that's a cinch. It wasn't any difficulty working with the young kids. The difficulty was with the mothers.
Fine. We have to break now. Thank you all very much for coming.